Morning, and welcome to Coffee and Conversation with the Honorable Mike Vickers, former Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Now, please welcome INSA Executive Vice President John Doyen.
Good morning, and welcome to our program. Today, we are pleased to host two senior IC leaders. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes to review. If you have questions, and we hope you do, please submit them through the questions box on the right side of your screen. We have nearly 300 registrants for today's program, so our moderator will do her best to get to all of your questions. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator and our speaker for today. Tish Long's accomplishments are many. She served as Director of NGA, Deputy Director of DIA, Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, and Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence. Added to that illustrious resume, this year marks Tish's 8th year of service as Chairwoman of INSA. Mike Vickers was Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and also served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, Low Intensity Conflict, and Interdependent Capabilities. Service that spanned the George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations. He had a central role in developing our strategy and overseeing our campaigns to disrupt and defeat Al-Qaeda and the operation to kill Osama bin Laden. As a CIA operations officer during the 1980s, he was the program officer and principal strategist for the largest and most successful covert action program in CIA's history, enabling the Afghan resistance to drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. His memoir, By All Means Available, covers these world-changing events and much more. It's my sincere pleasure to welcome Tish Long and Mike Vickers.
Thank you, John. Welcome to everyone. Thank you all for being with us this morning. Mike, good morning to you. It's great to see you.
It's great to see you, Tish, and good morning.
Yeah, so, you know, as John said, and I have right here, and I see you have on your bookshelf, your memoirs. And that's what we're here to do this morning, is to discuss your book, By All Means Available, Memoirs of a Life in Intelligence, Special Operations, and Strategy. Now, Mike, as you know, I read your book before it was published. You asked me to take a read, and, I told you that not only was it very well written, it was also, and it is, a really good read. It's very readable, and I've read it again, in preparation for our conversation this morning. And I remember talking to you, over the last couple of years while you've been writing it. So why did you write it, and how did you keep the momentum going? It's tough to write a book. So what kept you going?
Well, so to the last part, I actually wrote it when COVID hit. So for 3.5 months, I didn't have to travel hardly at all for board meetings, just some Zoom calls. And so I sat down and wrote 220,000 words and then sent it, to everybody, CIA, DOD, and others for clearance. And that took 10 months again because of COVID. But, for the 4 years before that, after I retired, I made a lot of notes, I outlined the book, but it was tough to sit down and really write. And so COVID provided the spur to just write 7 days a week, and that's what I did. And then to answer your question about why I wrote it. So 3 reasons, really. One, given some of the events I participated in, the Cold War and then war with Al-Qaeda and its allies, I felt I had a duty to history to explain, some of the operational aspects of these rather than the highest level that cabinet officials normally do. And then the second reason was, as you know, in the world of intelligence, we necessarily have to keep a lot of secrets, and our oversight is by select committees in Congress, and only some of that information is shared with the American people. So when appropriate and what it can be shared, I thought it was important to tell the American people some of the great things our intelligence professionals, special operators, and national security strategists do on their behalf, and also why we did things, why they work, sometimes spectacularly, why they don't in other cases. You know, in a democracy, if you're going to have support for these institutions, you have to have people buy in. And then the third reason really was I wanted to pass on what I'd learned and hopefully inspire the next generation of operators and strategists. You know, we're in an increasingly tough world, and it'll be a much better world if we continue to do well. And so I wanted to do what I can to help in that regard.
You know, so Mike, all three of those, obviously very good reasons. I particularly like the second and the third one. You know, intelligence operators, special forces operators are the unsung heroes. You know, they operate in the shadows. You don't hear about the successes, you only hear about the failures. So I think it's great that you spent all that time writing this to get it out there, and certainly, you know, to inform the next generation, which I believe your book is going to be on a lot of mandatory reading lists for college students this fall, and intelligence specialists and special forces operators who continue their education throughout their careers. So, you know, thanks for writing. Before we get into some of the operations, I have to say that in reading the book and in rereading it, it really looked like you mapped out your full career before you started. You know, enlisting in the Army, special operations as a Green Beret, operations officer at the CIA, and then your two policy jobs, which, you know, really put you at the nexus of some really important, you know, planning and strategic operations. So it seems like it was a really well thought out plan, was it?
Well, it helps to be lucky. I did have a plan when I was 19. I thought I wanted to go into the CIA and be an operations officer. I didn't know a lot about it, but I thought that that's where an individual could really make a difference in the Cold War. And I didn't have a college degree at the time. I had a year and a half of college, and I didn't want to wait. And so I thought, well, maybe I could be a Green Beret, you know, which is, again, kind of a crazy idea. But so I enlisted directly in for the Special Forces option and made it through the qualification course, and then became a Special Forces officer. And then after a tour in commanding a counterterrorism intelligence unit, I went over to CIA. That really is the last of the map out part. You know, after the Cold War, I got a graduate education, first Wharton for an MBA, and then Johns Hopkins for a PhD. And then after 9/11, President Bush asked me and a couple retired four-stars, Wayne Downing and Barry McCaffrey, to talk about Iraq strategy. And that's what really led to the assistant secretary job. And that then led to the undersecretary job. First, President Obama asked a few of us to stay on, Jim Clapper, Gates, and me. And then that one thing led to another. But it was really, you know, things built on each other after a while, but it wasn't a grand design from start to finish. You know, it was maybe the first 10 years were sort of planned out.
Sort of planned. Okay. Well, maybe towards the end, we'll ask you for some advice for aspiring officers, whether it's, you know, in the military or in the intelligence community. But, you know, let's talk about your early career. You know, starting out in Special Forces as a Green Beret, you know, give the audience a feel of what was your early training like? What were some of those early operations like? And what did you learn from them to help you later in your career?
Sure, it's a great question. So I spent 10 years in the Special Forces, almost half of it enlisted in a few different assignments, and then half as an officer. And in really two different theaters and two different missions. So the first half was primarily characterized by preparing for World War III. If we ever had the big war in Europe, I was in a Special Forces unit, the 10th Special Forces, that would try to conduct stay-behind operations if the Soviets overran part of Western Europe, but also go into Eastern Europe and try to halt the advance and work with resistance movements and hopefully liberate them. And that was the side I was on. And so part of my duties there was to train with a backpack nuclear weapon to parachute behind Soviet lines in the event of war and place this darn device and, if directed by National Command Authority, to detonate it. It seemed like a good idea when I was 23 years old. Not so much anymore.
Yeah, I actually cringed at that part in the book.
Yeah. But, after 9/11, where we were constantly at war, our operators, received great training, but then went on combat deployment after combat deployment. During the 70s and 80s, during my 10 years in the Special Forces, we didn't have a lot of that. And so there was a lot of time for training and, weapons, demolitions, free fall parachuting, advanced mountain climbing, close quarter battle tactics, counterterrorism tactics, and other things. And so I learned a lot that really helped me when I went to CIA and also studying the Soviet Army, et cetera. And I was blessed in my early years. I was a young guy on a team with a lot of Vietnam veterans who'd done a wide range of missions, Sante Raid and special reconnaissance missions, and working with large indigenous groups who mentored me. We had Eastern European emigres. One of them was the commander of our unit, a native Georgian, Othar Shalikashvili. And so I learned a lot from them about how to operate against the Soviets and in Eastern Europe. And so it was really a great education. And then after I became an officer, Central America was the hot thing with El Salvador and Nicaragua. So I went there and ended up commanding a counterterrorism intelligence unit.
I mean, that part, as I said, the whole book, very readable. That part of the book was fascinating for me because I really didn't know that about you. We didn't meet until you were the assistant secretary. So let's kind of take it the next step. So now you're at CIA and, you get asked to start planning Afghanistan and what really becomes the end of the Cold War.
Yeah.
So tell us how that came about and, give us some color, give us some background, and I'm sure we'll follow on questions.
Sure. So I went into CIA in a thing called the Career Training Program, a long program that had the operations course to train you to be a case officer and a paramilitary course, and then some on-the-job assignments. And before I even went in my first assignment in Latin America Division, before I had even gone to the operations course, I'd been in CIA only 4 months. Things started going badly in Grenada, and the guy who would become chief of station there for the invasion, Bill Rooney, who passed away a couple years ago, plucked me out of training, and I was one of the first 3 guys on the ground in Grenada with the invasion force. And,
so how unusual is that to get pulled into?
Yeah, the training staff didn't know about it for about a week or so, and they had, little heart palpitations after they learned. But so I was told to come in I knew, about the invasion because I was helping on the CIA side of it. And I was told to come in early on a Sunday, packed for 2 weeks. And I thought I was just going to some base to support things. And so I packed a bunch of suits and all that. And as soon as I got into headquarters, they told me, you're going in with the invasion force and the chief of station and a communicator. And here are all your targets and everything you're going to do. And so I had a Ralph Lauren polo shirt, some linen pants, loafers. They gave me a bag of tens of thousands of dollars to pay agents. I had a weapon and a satellite communication, and I thought this is a heck of a way to go to war, but at least it goes in style. So I was there for 2 weeks for all the combat operations. Had a few firefights and a few other interesting things, and then from there, when I came back from Grenada, 2 days before the invasion, the Marine barracks were blown up in Lebanon. And so I wanted to do a Soviet assignment. I had Russian and Czech. And they said, we've got another directed assignment for you in the Middle East. And I said, I don't know anything about it. And it's okay, you have a counterterrorism background, and we just had this bombing, and we had the embassy bombing before that. And that was about identifying the perpetrators, a special task force, and then developing response options. And where Grenada was really an exhilarating experience, Lebanon was a very searing one for me. Our chief of station I worked closely with was kidnapped and tortured and ultimately executed. Other Americans were kidnapped. Of course, the Marine bombing was a horrible tragedy, and lots of things on that. And and then intelligence wasn't properly shared. There were a lot of lessons learned, but
a lot of lessons learned.
It really set the stage for me for later years. It's something I never forgot. And then when I finished my training, then I was selected for this Afghanistan job at the time that the program had just had its budget increased by 300% by a congressman named Charlie Wilson. And so to me, this was the job of a lifetime to be able to fight our main enemy, the Soviet Union, with the biggest program already at that point. And then, we had convinced CIA's leadership and the national security principles, and ultimately the president, and then Congress, to double our budget again. So the budget went up by a factor of 12 in 1 month, in 1 year, and lots of sophisticated weapons and training and intelligence. And that's what enabled the Afghan resistance to win. And so it was the experience of a lifetime.
And I mean, a lot of things had to come together to make that happen. And experience of a lifetime. And part of that's being in the right place at the right time. But obviously part of that is excelling in everything you had done to that point. So for the audience, you can see the slide on the screen. We do want to hear from you. We have a number of questions rolling in. So, Mike, let's keep moving on. So, so then how long were you at CIA, and then what came next?
So after the Soviets started withdrawing and the Cold War was coming to an end, I had gotten special promotions, and and I really had exposure to all the top levels of the agency, across the agency, and had many years of education in a few years. And a number of senior officers said to me, well, what are you going to do next? And I said, well, I don't know, I want to do something like this again. Well, there is nothing like this again. If you're lucky, it comes around once in a generation. And they said, you're probably going to be bored. And so they offered me a nice chief of base job, but that was less than what I was doing. And so I went and talked to the career management staff, and they said, all right, you've done these great things and we've rewarded you for it, but you kind of have to go now do regular case officer tours. And it was sort of starting over for me. And I didn't really want to do that. I mean, I really struggled with the idea, but with the Cold War coming to an end, I thought, okay, maybe I should get some graduate education and then come back into government at a senior level. And, you asked earlier about my plans. That was the extent of my plan. And to this day, I still don't know if I made the right decision leaving CIA or not, because I really loved it. But I did some graduate education. I was only at CIA for a total of 3 years, 2 years, just a little over a year in training in Grenada and Lebanon, and then 2 years on Afghanistan. And then came back into government in the mid-Bush administration.
So and you made mention of this. So, you were one of, I think it was only 3 senior officials who transitioned from the Bush administration to the Obama administration. And, I was at DIA at the time.
Right, deputy.
And what was that like, working for 2 different administrations? I mean, that's rare, as far as I recall, throughout my career and all of the many presidential transitions that I supported. So you were actually in the same job when the administration transitioned. So what were the differences in policy and priorities and focus, and just, maybe a little bit of atmospherics working for, and I don't really even want to say Republican administration and then Democratic, because for intelligence officers,
Right,
that doesn't really matter to us. But
right,
two distinct administrations. Talk about that.
right. So it was Bob Gates as secretary, Jim Clapper is at the time USDI, and then later, and then me, as assistant secretary for special ops and lots of other stuff. And so the last couple years of the Bush administration were characterized, that's when Bob Gates came in, I came in, Clapper came in, was characterized by turning around Iraq and then starting to deal with a deteriorating situation in Afghanistan. So there was what President Bush called a silent surge in Afghanistan, big surge in Iraq, but did everything we could to help shore up Afghanistan. And then a thing that President Bush really did that was just extraordinary, which was the last year and a half of his administration, as the threat from Al-Qaeda really rose up. After they resettled in the federally administered tribal areas, and we had the 2006 transatlantic airliner plot where Al-Qaeda wanted to blow up 10 airliners over the Atlantic. We decided to really take the gloves off and come up with a new strategy. And so worked closely with Mike Hayden and other Steve Kappas and others, and Bill McRaven eventually, and came up with this strategy and presented it to President Bush in August 2008, and then to the top leadership of the Congress a little bit after, and started these drone campaigns and a few other things against Al-Qaeda that eventually really, in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, and then a little more globally, that really broke their back within a few years. And so that, and then there was Iran's nuclear program. And so Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, Iraq, and Iran were the things that were really handed off. And, and I would add Russia had invaded Georgia. It was a 5-day war, but it signaled, where we're heading today. And so a lot of people don't realize this, but there was a lot more continuity between President Obama's first term and President Bush's second term than people realize. A lot of these things were continued or accelerated. So the war with Al-Qaeda, President Obama accepted and then intensified it. And that helped break Al-Qaeda's back. He did 2 surges in Afghanistan his first year, one a very, very big one with Stan McChrystal, and then continued efforts to try to keep Iran from getting the bomb and draw down in Iraq as the surge really worked in Iraq, but gradually until unfortunately we had to leave at the end of 2011. So, the couple of points on the kind of the color. As I said, there was a lot more continuity than people realized, and it was a really strong team with Gates and Secretary Clinton as Secretary of State, and Leon Panetta at CIA, and Tom Donilon after a year as NSC advisor, et cetera. And John Brennan, in the White House as counterterrorism advisor. And one of the tasks I had, when all the political appointees go away, there weren't hardly any of us left at the senior level, just me and Clapper, and it looked like a ghost town until the new people were confirmed. And so it fell upon me kind of over Christmas, or Secretary Gates and Admiral Mullen, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, asked me to do this, to prepare the transition book for President Obama, all the things he needed to be briefed on, including the most sensitive stuff that you only get the day you take office.
Once you're president.
Nuclear weapons and I had oversight of nuclear weapons on down, and so I was the guy who had to prepare the book, and it was a heck of an experience assembling all this stuff in one thing. The Joint Staff action officers who had parts of it said, gee, this thing's radioactive. I'm glad you've got it, not me. But, so that did that. And then the first year of an administration, there's usually a review of all the major programs, as they sort out their policy. So covert action programs and everything else. And I participated in a lot of that. But within that first year, because we were at war, I mean, this is the first wartime transition we had since 1968, across parties. And so they really had baptism by fire and, had to deal with a lot of stuff that first year. So, it was exciting times.
Well, and you can certainly see how your early career operational experience helped inform. I mean, you knew what it was like to carry that nuclear backpack, to parachute in, with one. And then, of course, counterterrorism operations, mountain operations. So I think the nation was well served by your early operational experience to then have you in those really key policy roles.
Well, thank you.
So let's stay on Afghanistan. A lot of technology being used in the war in Afghanistan, and obviously a lot of operations, a lot of different operations than had been done before. So all of this together being developed really made great progress in Afghanistan. At the end, what should we have done different?
Yeah, so I think it was a strategic mistake to completely withdraw from Afghanistan. We made our shares of mistakes, overdoing nation building, trying to do the impossible. Some of it was necessary and very useful and important, but we had successfully transitioned to Afghan security forces that were built. We had, a number of advisors there and some special operators and in surveillance aircraft and that plus offshore air power based elsewhere in the Middle East was enough to keep the Taliban at bay. They never could have won unless we just left. And so that was a decision that was made across two administrations, the late Trump and then early Biden. And, as I said, I and others, Ryan Crocker and others, think it was a mistake to do that. It creates the conditions again for, Al Qaeda had safe haven provided to it by the Haqqani network and other extremist groups. They're now in power in Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is strategic real estate in between Iran, Russia, and China as well. And so, but, it is what it is now. And so we're having to do things, as they say, from over the horizon.
Yeah, and I know that a number of people share your views, myself included. Questions are really rolling in. I'm going to start taking some from the audience. And in fact, that last one was mine, but it was also Gordon Hanna's. So Gordon, glad you're on with us here this morning.
Hi, Gordon.
Here is kind of sticking, well, let's talk about Ukraine. How is the war in Ukraine? And this comes from Natalie Colon with Ben's. How has the war in Ukraine, just to use hers, shaped the future of US warfare?
So it's the biggest land war in Europe since World War II. And so there's a lot of things about high intensity conventional land war that I think inform our defense of NATO, and particularly on Russia's periphery in the Baltics and elsewhere. It shows once again, as we knew in the Cold War, that we have a saying in the Army that, artillery is the king of battle, infantry is the queen of battle. And but artillery, and particularly as you've added precision weapons and greater range and greater with rockets as well as cannon, and then the intelligence to do the targeting has just become even more powerful. And so winning the artillery duel becomes really critical, and then the war of combined arms movement. Ukraine is unique in the sense that it is, sort of a crowdsourced war. You have a lot of emerging technology that's been going into Ukraine to help connect software networks, make them more resilient, connect, feeds of ISR assets, etc. And it's also a war with large-scale use of drones, very, very small ones, but it makes life tough on the front lines that you're under surveillance a lot, makes movement difficult. And then you see these attacks on population centers. Now, I don't know if that will carry forward in future conflicts, but you have these just hit something, hit kindergartens or schools or nursing homes or others, and they're just launching missiles or drones into these populated areas. And so Ukraine has a lot of unique aspects. One more is the importance of, given your questionnaire from Ben's, is the critical importance of the defense industrial base and to be able to sustain this kind of production. This brings us almost all the way back to World War I and then World War II, where the US was the arsenal of democracy. If we got in a fight with China, it would be different weapons that we might be using, but you'd still have the same issue of, do I have enough of them, to sustain? I might win a first battle, but can I win the war? Which industrial base will produce enough? So there's a lot of lessons learned, and for us to adapt our defense establishment to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you raised the good point on, what might future conflict look like based on this does depend on the aggressor.
Yes.
Is China going to do what Russia is doing?
Right.
Particularly when it comes to the psychological warfare parts, with targeting civilians. So I think you actually answered Terry Lung's question, because she also wanted to know how did Russia's war in Ukraine compare to the Soviet war in Afghanistan?
Yeah, so this one is conventional, obviously, versus unconventional from our perspective. But a lot of it's the same, the importance of scale and speed, and making sure if you want to win, you really have to do enough. You can't just help them fight or not lose, because that's the choice we faced initially in Afghanistan.
Exactly.
People didn't think we could win, and then we did. And so I'm an advocate of giving Ukraine everything that it needs to win, including the air power and the surveillance aircraft and the longer range missiles, because defeating Russia is one of the best things we can do for the security of Europe and even for our China strategy, given they're allied and et cetera. So,
okay, so I want to take this two different ways. One is China and one is intelligence. Let's start with China. So Marcel Letra is on. Marcel from Lockheed. Good morning, Marcel. And Marcel asks, so drawing from all of your life experiences, how should we be approaching this strategy vis-a-vis China? You're the great strategist.
So
how should we be thinking about this?
So a little unusual for a memoir. I have a chapter at the end of the book on winning the new Cold War. There's some debate about whether it's a Cold War. It's certainly new if it is. It's not the same as the old Cold War. And I argue that there's 5 things that we really need to do. And the most important one is really getting our domestic house in order, to rebuild a sense of national unity that while we can differ about certain policies, that we see we're in a long-term competition that really matters. And, we all have a common interest in that as Americans. And, that has economic dimensions, information dimensions, political dimensions, requires national political leadership to create that or recreate it. That's certainly not my expertise, but I believe it's critically important. And a lot of my former colleagues, at the 4-star level and civilian equivalent believe that too. The second one, I think, is really the central competition, which is winning the economic and technological competition with China, particularly in AI and quantum computing and synthetic biology that will determine future economic power, but also national security power as well. And like any competition, there are asymmetries in that what we're spending on R&D now is about 1/4 of our GDP percentage terms than we did in the 50s and 60s. And so I think we need to ramp up there as well. And then there's the, intelligence and peacetime actions, covert action, and other competitions, proxy wars, much like the Cold War. Cold wars between superpowers tend to remain cold or indirect, at least. The fighting, one side may be direct, the other side indirect, because the risk of escalation. And that's likely to be true. It doesn't mean it's a guarantee, but it's likely to be true again. But you got to prevail in that. And then they're strengthening our military deterrent in the region as well as globally. I argue that space and cyber are the two critical domains. They're the real global domains. And we have advantages in undersea warfare and global strike we want to maintain. But the and then transforming our institutions and alliances, for these other four things. And key point about this strategy is that if you deter major conflict, it doesn't mean you win the Cold War. It will be determined by other things, by global influence, by that economic and technological competition, by this clash of systems, between autocratic capitalism and democratic capitalism, and how it plays out around the world. So you have to really posture yourself and think, how am I going to win that, as well as deter, great power war. So it's a long answer to your question, Marcel's question, but that's a summary of what I say in the book.
Perfect. Helped me get through my coughing fit there. And Mike, if you haven't thought about what's next, a college professor might be in your future. I mean, that truly was a great rundown from the strategic or strategy development perspective on all the moving parts that you have to take into account. So,
well, thank you for the compliment. I'll tell you just a quick funny story. I finally finished my PhD dissertation when I was back in government as an assistant secretary, and I was 95% done. And I thought, well, what do I need this for at this point? I'm going to do something else when I retire. So I had a 1-year extension. And I let 8 months go by, and my wife at Christmas time said, please finish. You might want to be a professor or a dean or something. And I said, I don't think so. She says, well, I have 5 daughters. And she said, you need to finish because you'll set a bad example for our daughters if you don't finish. And so that was the trick and got me to finish.
Well, good for you and good for Milana, your wife, who is also in the business. Yes. For giving you that last extra push.
That kick, yeah.
So one of the 5 things you just hit on, Mike, was technology.
Mm-hmm.
And there's any number of questions here from folks, asking about emerging technologies. Is the intelligence community and the Department of Defense investing in the right areas? How are they doing and I know, your role at In-Q-Tel, how are they doing? What should they be doing different to transition from R&D to operational? So spend some time talking about the importance of technology, the importance of our defense industrial base. We have a lot of our industry partners here this morning, and your views on, are we investing in the right areas and doing the right things?
Sure. So there's no one right answer to that. I mean, there's things we really need from the traditional defense industrial base. We have advantages in a number of key areas. I mentioned before, undersea warfare, global strike, space for now, certain aspects of cyber that we really want to sustain. And then we need the munitions, the capacity. We talked about that. But all these new technologies, which some are in the traditional defense industrial base and some are outside it, it's very important for the national security establishment and the government as a whole to fund these things and then to use them both for economic power purposes, but also where appropriate national security power. And that can be autonomous weapons with AI, various aspects of quantum technologies from sensing to code breaking and code making and others. And one of the things I also write about in that last chapter, I think it helps if you're a senior leader of an operational agency, say Department of Defense or CIA, the two that I know best, but is to think, well, how does this new environment and new technologies really affect my core business? And it differs, and so where should I place a bet? And so
Mhm.
and it differs based on what you're trying to do. So for an operations officer now, you have to really deal with a more transparent world and a thing we call ubiquitous technical surveillance, where there's cameras everywhere and they're integrated into networks, and they can watch the population so much, and you have to think, how do I operate in that environment to where I can do something, but they don't think I'm doing anything abnormal. So unlike the Cold War with the Soviets, where you had people following you all the time in cars or on foot, and you had to find blind spots to operate there, or get blacked in some other way. Now you're dealing with a big technical surveillance challenge. And then when you think about moving things, with commercial satellites and everything else, you have a global transparency problem. So, and then as you know well, the volume of information that you get, and how do I process that? At your old agency, I know when you were the director there, you were embarking on this activity-based intelligence of how do I deal with this large volume, which is critically important, and we're a decade on in that, but it's not going away. So, so there are a lot of different problems for people in different areas, whether they're developing the technology, whether we're funding it, whether we're making it easier to acquire some of it, or whether we're thinking about what does it mean for my agency and how I operate.
So to that last point, and you really talked a lot about your training and preparation in the early chapters of the book. Based on what is happening today, are we training our young folks, whether it's special operators, whether it's CIA case officers, whether it's our intelligence analysts, to handle all of this information, disinformation, misinformation? So from the operator to the analyst, are we training our folks to be successful in this new environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are, but I think we're just getting started because the environment is evolving so rapidly. And so it's not like we've got the answer right now. We figured it out, and our programs are set. As the technology evolves and the problem morphs, you have to continually adapt your training to that, or you discover new challenges that you have to overcome, or new opportunities. And that was true in the Cold War. It was true with the war with Al Qaeda. As we learned to use things better, our Predator fleet, initially we didn't use it very well. We didn't have enough of them, and we knew some of the things it could do. We really didn't know all the things we could do with this thing, which we learned, after using it a lot and experimenting and developing new technologies, and really became a pretty decisive instrument. So, the same is true, I think, here. And, but it's also the kind of expertise you bring to these jobs. We'll need more technology steeped analysts, for instance. You raise the issue of intelligence analysts. If a core competition, the competition in AI and quantum and other things, you want analysts who really understand that stuff, as well as the national security implications of it. So there's a lot of human capital aspects to it, too, not just training.
Well said. And that was an amalgamation of questions, but John Pereira was a part of that.
All
so
right.
John, you're back on already. I've got so many more questions. Do I get to ask one or two more? One more. All right. Gosh. So towards the end of the book, let's stay on the people part, Mike. Towards the end of the book, you lay out 10 principles that worked for you, that you think helped, make you as successful as you were. I was going to ask you about the fourth principle, which is the importance of mentors. And, was there a mentor that stood out for you? That said, author's choice, which of those 10 principles would you like to talk about as far as, what worked for you and what your advice might be for those aspiring to be just like you?
Well, I think the mentors one is a good one because, I was blessed with that throughout my career, from a special forces soldier to an officer to CIA officer in various areas to then, a policymaker and IC leader. And mentors do different things. Sometimes they teach you, but other times they just believe in you and give you big responsibilities beyond what you should have or what you're currently doing, and turn you loose and have your back. And it's a good lesson if you're thinking about the what you really want from a mentor. But it's also, to me, more, I was really talking to potential mentors there. There's lots of ways you can help people along their path. It may be identifying them and then really stretching them rather than just, teaching them things. And so that seems great. It was certainly, I benefited from them immensely. Like, I wouldn't have had that Afghanistan job without people believing that I could do it, because it was 2 jobs combined into one, and both were 3 or 4 grades above where I was at the time. And I don't know what they saw in me, but it gave me this huge opportunity. And then the same thing at very senior levels. Secretary Gates, I consider a critical mentor of mine, because he gave me a lot more responsibilities than I might have had just by the narrow definition of the jobs that I had. So I just think it's critical to think about as we grow our next generation and look for talent.
Absolutely. And I can certainly say you did that with me. So thank you. You were one of my bosses as I was director NGA, and you challenged me and you pushed me, and you gave me the ability to do the job. So
you were fantastic. And then, the other thing I would say from your career, just to elaborate, John may kick us off in a second, but you did exciting things in your career and then broadened. And without going into detail, I think that's a really good pattern. Find something you love, find something you can make a difference at. It's out there somewhere. Get good at it, and then discover a broader world. But and because there's lots of other exciting things. And so by the time you were director of NGA, you were teaching me more than I was helping you. But if we ran out of time, if there's interest, I'd love to come back. But thank you so much for this opportunity.
Well, Mike, thank you. You should be very proud of all you accomplished in your career, of everything you have done for the security of our nation. And you have written just a tremendous book. We've had the link in the chat room. So hopefully we'll get more people reading and understanding the importance of our silent warriors, our special forces, our intelligence operators, and just all the good that they do and the great things that you did. So thank you very much, and congratulations on a great book.
Well, thank you, Tish.
And thank you, Tish, and also thank you, Mike, and congratulations. And we really appreciated your candid insights and reflections and advice. Very informative discussion, and I'm sure the audience will be interested in reading your book if they haven't done that already. And to everyone who joined us online, thank you for taking time out of your morning to watch. When the webinar ends, there will be a short survey that pops up. Please take a few moments to complete it and let us know how we did. Looking ahead, we'd like to let you know on July 13th and 14th, we will hold the 10th Intelligence and National Security Summit in partnership with AFCEA International. We have an incredible speaker lineup ready to discuss the key issues facing the community. And in addition, there's an exhibit floor full of innovative products and service solutions. We expect about 2,000 attendees to join us for this program, and details can be found online at intelsummit.org. Also on August the 3rd, INSA will hold a leadership dinner with Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Dr. Stacy Dixon. She will discuss some of her top priorities, including AI and emerging technology, the IC data strategy, the future of open source, and collaboration with industry partners. And on August the 8th, we'll be back online with a virtual program on space resiliency, leveraging commercial innovation to advance the mission. Pete Mund, Director of the Commercial Systems Program Office at NRO, is already confirmed to speak. You can learn about this program and more on the INSA website, insaonline.org. This concludes this morning's program. Have a wonderful day.